You made it here, and that's enough for tonight. Tonight, I want to talk about a story, not just any story. A story that many of us heard when we were very young. A story that seemed simple and magical when we were children, but carried a message that quietly stayed with us as we grew older. It's the story of Cinderella. Most of us know it. A kind young woman who lives a difficult life. She works from morning until night. She cleans, she cooks, she takes care of everyone around her. She asks for very little. She never complains, even when she's tired unfairly, even when she feels alone. Cinderella continues to do what she believes is right. She keeps working. She keeps giving. She keeps hoping. And the story promises something very comforting. It tells us that one day all of this patience and hard work will be rewarded. One day someone will finally notice her goodness. One day her life will change. And suddenly everything will make sense. As children, we hear this story and it feels beautiful. It feels hopeful. It tells us that kindness matters, that patience matters, that goodness will eventually be seen one day. But as many women grew older, something begins to feel different, because the story of Cinderella is not just a fairy tale. In many ways, it becomes a quiet lesson. A lesson about what it means to be a good woman. From a very young age, many girls begin hearing messages that sound surprisingly similar to Cinderella's story. Be helpful, be kind, work hard, take care of others. Don't be difficult, don't complain, be silent. And at first, these lessons seem harmless. Kindness is a beautiful thing. Helping others is important. caring for family and friends can bring meaning to our lives. But something subtle begins to happen over time. But something inside of us begins to happen over the time. The message slowly changes. It stops being about kindness and starts becoming about sacrifice. Girls begin to understand, sometimes without anyone saying it directly, that their value comes from what they do for others, from how much they give, from how much they endure, from how little space they take for themselves. And so, without realizing it, many women grew up carrying a quiet belief inside of them. A belief that sounds something like this: if I work hard enough, if I take care of everyone, if I put other people first, then one day I will finally be loved, finally appreciated, finally seen. This belief can shape a life in a very powerful ways, because it teaches women to keep giving even when they are tired, completely exhausted, to keep helping even when they are overwhelmed, to keep carrying responsibilities that no one else seems to notice. And often they do this with a smile, just like Cinderella. But tonight I want to gently ask a question that many women eventually begin to ask themselves. What if this story was never meant to be a life plan? What if the role of Cinderella was simply a story we were told, but not the only story we are allowed to live? Because real life is not a fairy tale. There is no magical midnight moment where everything suddenly becomes perfect. There is no prince arriving to reward years of silence and sacrifice. And many women, after years of doing everything they are thought to do begin to feel something they never expected, and it's not happiness, not peace, not joy, but exhaustion and confusion. They begin to wonder why giving everything to others has not brought the fulfillment the story promised. And slowly, a realization begins to appear, a quiet realization. Maybe the story of Cinderella was never meant to define a woman's life. Maybe it was simply a story. And maybe, just maybe, women are allowed to write a different one. Before a girl even understands the word, she begins learning how she is expected to move inside it. No one sits her down and says, "Your job is to give everything away." It happens quietly. It happens slowly. In small moments that seem harmless at first. A little girl helps set the table. Everyone smiles. She is such a good girl. She shares her toys with others, even when she doesn't want to. Again, people smile. Look how kind she is. When she stays quiet instead of arguing, she is praised. See, that's how a nice girl behaves. And of course, kindness and generosity are beautiful things. There is nothing wrong with teaching children to care about others. But something subtle often happens along the way. The lesson slowly changes. Instead of learning that kindness, it's one part of being human. Girls sometimes begin to learn that their value comes from how much they give up for others. They begin to notice something. When they help others, they are loved. When they stay quiet, they are liked. When they take care of everyone else, they are called good girl. And so, very gently, without anyone realizing it, the training begins. Girls start becoming experts at reading the needs of everyone around them. They notice when someone is upset. They notice when someone needs help. They learn to make sure everyone else feels comfortable. And often they become very good at it. So good, in fact, that by the time they grow up, they can carry entire households on their shoulders without anyone even noticing their efforts. But while they are learning to take care of others, something important is often left behind. They are rarely taught to ask themselves a simple question: what do I need? Not later, not after everyone else is happy, but now. Many women grow up without ever practicing that question. Because from a young age, they learned that putting themselves first might make them seem selfish or difficult or unkind. So they learn to wait. They learn to postpone their own needs. They learn to believe that one day, after everyone else is taken care of, their turn will finally come, just like in the fairy tale. Just like Cinderella waiting by the fireplace, believing that someday her patience will be rewarded. But life rarely follows the script. And as years pass, many women slowly realize something that no one ever told them when they were little girls. Taking care of everyone else does not automatically mean someone will take care of you. And giving everything away does not always lead to feeling loved. Sometimes it only leads to feeling invisible. This realization does not come all at once. It appears slowly, like a quiet question forming somewhere deep inside. when you feel empty, when you feel exhausted. A question that many women eventually ask themselves: who am I when I'm not taking care of everyone else? And that question, gentle as it is, becomes the beginning of something very important. Because the moment a woman begins asking it, the whole story starts to loosen its hold. The Cinderella script begins to fade. And a new possibility begins to appear. The possibility that her life was never meant to build around endless sacrifice. That maybe, just maybe, she was always allowed to be more than the girl in the ashes. As girls grew into women, something interesting begins to happen. The lessons they learned when they were young slowly turn into expectations, not always spoken, not always written anywhere, but felt everywhere. A woman walks into a room and almost without thinking, she begins noticing everything. Who looks tired? Who might need help? Who forgot something? Who might be uncomfortable? It becomes automatic. She learns to sense the emotional temperature of the room. If someone is upset, she feels responsible for calming things down. If something is not working, she feels responsible for fixing it. If someone else is struggling, she feels responsible for helping. And often, she does all of this quietly, without asking for recognition, without even realizing how much energy it takes. Many women become experts at carrying invisible work, the kind of work that is rarely listed on any schedule. Remembering birthdays, checking if everyone ate, making sure the house runs smoothly, noticing when someone is sad, holding conversations together, keeping peace in the family. These things might seem small when they won, but together they form an enormous emotional weight. And the strange part is that much of this work goes unseen. When things run smoothly, no one thinks about the person who quietly held everything together. It simply looks like life is working. But behind the scenes, there is often a woman carefully managing dozens of little details every single day. This is sometimes called emotional labor, but in many homes and families, it simply feels like what women do. And because this work has been expected for so long, it often becomes invisible, not only to others, but sometimes even to women themselves. They become so used to carrying this responsibility that they begin to believe it is simply part of who they are. Just like Cinderella, sweeping the floors and tending the fire, working quietly while the world continues around her. But there is something important to understand here. No one of these qualities are weakness. Being attentive, being caring, being thoughtful. These are beautiful human strengths. The problem begins when these strengths turn into silent obligations. When a woman begins to feel that she must always be the one holding everything together, that she must always be patient, always understanding, always available, even when she's exhausted. Over time, this can create a quiet imbalance, because while she's taking care of everyone else, the question is, who is taking care of her? Often, no one asks that question. Not because people are cruel, but because the world has grown used to the idea that women will simply manage everything. And so, the expectations continue, year after year, generation after generation, until one day many women pause and realize something surprising. They have spent so much time making sure everyone else is okay that they never stopped to ask if they themselves are okay. And that moment, that small pause, is where something begins to shift. Because once a woman starts noticing the invisible weight she has been carrying, she can no longer pretend it isn't there. And when the awareness begins, the whole story starts to crack. The Cinderella story. The one that said a good woman should quietly endure everything. Slowly, gently. That story begins to lose its power. For a moment, let's return to the old story, the one we were told when we were children. Cinderella wakes up before everyone else. She cleans the floors. She prepares the food. She takes care of the house. She listens. She obeys. She asks for very little. And no matter how unfair things become, she continues quietly, patiently, almost as if she believes that something good is waiting for her somewhere in the future. And this is the most important part of the fairy tale, the promise. Because the story is not really about the work Cinderella does. It's about what the story tells us will happen because she does it. The fairy tale whispers something very comforting. It says, if you are patient enough, if you are kind enough, if you sacrifice enough, someone will finally see how good you are. And when that moment arrives, everything will change. The prince will appear. The suffering will end. The girl who walked quietly in the ashes will suddenly be lifted into a beautiful new life. It feels hopeful and it feels beautiful, almost magical. And when we are young, it makes perfect sense. We want to believe that goodness will always be rewarded. that kindness will always be noticed, that the world will eventually be fair. But when women grow older, something strange begins to happen. Many of them follow the same path the story described. They work hard, they help others, they give their time, their attention, they give their time, they care, they try to be patient, understanding, supportive. And they do these things not because they are weak, but because they believe these qualities make them good people. But slowly, a quiet realization begins to form, because in real life, the reward does not always arrive the way the story promised. There is no magical night where everything suddenly changes. There is no prince who appears simply because someone has been patient for long enough. Life does not follow the net structure of a fairy tale, and this can create a strange and painful feeling. Because many women begin to wonder, I did everything I was supposed to do. I tried to be kind. I tried to take care of everyone. I worked hard. So, why do I still feel so tired? Why do I still feel unseen? This moment is often confusing. And because it feels like the promise of the story has somehow been broken. But the truth is something different. The promise itself was never real. Not in the way the fairy tale described it. The idea that a woman must suffer quietly until someone finally rescues her. That idea belongs to stories, not to real life. And once a woman begins to see that clearly, something profound begins to shift inside her. Because if the word promise was never true, then perhaps the life built around that promise can also be questioned. Perhaps the endless waiting can stop. Perhaps the belief that love must be earned through exhaustion can finally be released. And in that moment, a new possibility appears. A woman begins to wonder what life might look like if she stopped waiting for the prince. And started choosing herself instead. At some point in a woman's life, something begins to change, not subtly, not dramatically. It happens quietly, almost invisible. She wakes up one morning and realizes she feels tired. Not the kind of tired that disappears after a good night's sleep, but a deeper kind of tired. A tiredness that has been building slowly for years. Sometimes it shows up in small moments. She sits down for a moment of rest and immediately she feels guilty. She says yes to something she doesn't really have the energy for. She finishes helping everyone else, only to realize there is no time left for herself. And she tells herself the same thing she has always believed. Maybe tomorrow will be easier. So she continues. She continues working, caring, listening, supporting, solving problems, holding things together. From the outside, everything might look normal, maybe even successful. She is responsible, dependable, the one people can count on. But inside, something begins to feel heavy, because the truth is that carrying so much responsibility for so long begins to take its toll. Many women become so used to taking care of everyone else that they forgot what it feels like to be taken care of. They become so used to being strong that they forget what it feels like to rest. And because they have been praised their whole life for being capable and reliable, they often hesitate to admit how exhausted they truly feel. After all, the world seems them as the one who can handle everything. But even the strongest person cannot carry everything forever. And slowly, that quiet exhaustion begins to whisper questions. Questions that once felt impossible to ask. Why am always the one holding everything together? Why do I feel responsible for everyone else's happiness? Why do I feel guilty when I want something for myself? Because they challenge a role that many women have lived inside for years. The role of the helper, the caretaker, the one who gives. But those questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of awareness. They are the first small cracks appearing in the whole story. The story that said a good woman must always sacrifice. The story that said a woman's needs should come last. And when those questions begin to appear, they rarely disappear again. Because the moment a woman notices her own exhaustion, she begins to realize something important. She was never meant to carry the entire world on her shoulders. And the moment she understands that, the whole story begins to lose its hold. The Cinderella story, the story of endless patience and silent sacrifice. The story that said suffering quietly would eventually bring happiness. Little by little, that story begins to fade, and in its place, a new understanding slowly begins to grow. There comes a moment in many women's life that feels small on the outside, but is powerful on the inside. It might happen during a quiet evening, or while washing dishes, or during a conversation that sadly leaves a strange feeling in the heart. A woman pauses, and for the first time she notices something she had never allowed herself to see clearly before. Not just tasks, not just responsibility, but expectations. Expectations about who she should be, how patient she should be, should give, how little she should ask for yes, she followed these expectations almost automatically, because that is what she had been taught. That's what good women do. They help, they support, they sacrifice. But suddenly, a quiet thought appears, a thought that feels almost surprising. Why does it always have to be me? At first, the question feels uncomfortable, maybe even a little frightening, because questioning the role you have lived inside for so long can feel like stepping into unknown territory. For many women, the role of the caregiver, the helper, the one who keeps everything together, has been part of their identity. It's how others see them. It's how they have learned to see themselves. So, when the question appears, why am I always the one giving? It can create a strange mix of emotions, confusion, it can be guilt, maybe curiosity, but also something else, something that feels quietly powerful, awareness. For the first time, a woman begins to see the pattern of her life from the outside. She notices how often she puts herself last, how quickly she says yes to things that drain her energy, how easily she dismisses her own needs. And she begins to wonder, who decided this is how my life should look? Because when she really thinks about it, she cannot remember the moment she consciously chose this role. She simply grew into it, like Cinderella, slowly becoming the girl who walked in the ashes, not because she wanted that life, but because the story around her made it seem normal. And once a woman begins to see that pattern clearly, something inside her shifts. She realizes that the script she has been following was written long before she arrived. It came from old traditions, old expectations. It came from old stories about what a good woman should be. And sadly, the most important realization appears. If the script was written by someone else, then maybe it can be rewritten. Then maybe it can be reversed. Maybe her life does not have to follow the same path. Maybe she is allowed to ask for rest, allowed to take up space, allowed to choose herself. This realization does not arrive all at once. It grows slowly, but once it begins, the whole story, the Cinderella story, can never feel quite the same again. Because the moment a woman starts questioning the script, she is already stepping outside of it. Once a woman begins asking quiet questions, something important starts to happen. She begins to see the story differently, not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity. For most of her life, the expectations around her felt normal, almost natural, as if this was simply the way things were meant to be. Women care for others. Women keep the peace. Women carry the emotional weight of the family. That's just how the world works, or so it seems. But when she takes a step back and really looks at it, something becomes clear. This role was never a natural law. It was a story repeated so many times that it began to feel like truth. Stories and books, stories and movies, stories passed down through generations, stories about the good woman, the patient woman, the sacrificing woman, the woman who waits quietly while everyone else life moves forward. And Cinderella is only one version of that story. There are many others, different names, different settings, but often the same message hidden underneath. A woman proves her worth through how much she gives, through how much she endures, through how little she asks for herself. For a long time, these stories shaped the way many women saw their lives. They become silent guidelines, unwritten rules. But once a woman begins to see them clearly, something changes. Stories are powerful, but they are still just stories. They are ideas created by people in different times, under different circumstances. They are not permanent. They are not destiny. And they certainly are not the only way a woman's life can unfold. This realization can feel both freeing and unsettling at the same time. Because once the myth becomes visible, it can no longer hide in the background. a woman begins to notice the world expectations everywhere. In conversations and traditions, people make about who should carry the responsibility, but she also begins to notice something else. She begins to notice women who are living differently, women who still care deeply about others, but who also care about themselves, women who create space for their own dreams, who speak honestly about their limits, who refuse to disappear in order to make everyone else comfortable. And suddenly, a new idea begins to grow. Maybe kindness does not require self-assurance. Maybe love does not require constant sacrifice. Maybe being a good woman does not mean becoming invisible. And when that understanding begins to settle into the hearts, the whole fairy tale starts to lose its authority. The girl in the ashes no longer feels like a role that must be played. She becomes what she always truly was, a character in a story that many women once believed, but a story they are now free to step out of. And when a woman realizes that the script was never permanent, she begins to imagine something powerful. A life that does not resolve around waiting to be chosen. A life she is the one doing the choosing. Once a woman begins to see the whole story clearly, something quiet but profound starts to happen. She begins to notice moments in her daily life where the whole script tries to take control again. Someone asks for her help when she's already exhausted, or someone expects her to solve a problem that is not really hers to solve. Someone assumes she will say yes because she always has. And for a long time, the answer would have been automatic. Yes, of course. But now, something inside her pauses. Just for a second. And in that small pause, a new thought appears. I don't have to. This moment might seem small to others, but inside it can feel enormous. Because for many women, saying no for the first times feels unfamiliar. Sometimes even frightening. They worry that others will think they are selfish or difficult or uncaring. These fears are not surprising. After all, for years they all thought that a good woman keeps everyone happy. But slowly they began to discover setting boundaries is not bad. Resting is not laziness. Taking care of herself is not selfish. It is simply human. And as a woman begins practicing these small acts of self-respect, something surprising happens. The world does not collapse. The sky does not fall. Life continues. In fact, something better begins to grow. She has more energy, more clarity, more space in her life. And for the first time in a long time, she begins to feel present in her own story. Breaking the whole script does not mean becoming cold or uncaring. It does not mean abandoning kindness or compassion. It simply means that kindness now includes herself as well. For so long, the Cinderella story taught women that goodness meant giving everything away. But real goodness is not built on exhaustion. Real kindness does not require someone to disappear. A woman can care deeply about others while still protecting her own well-being. She can support people she loves without carrying every burden alone. She can be generous without sacrificing her entire life. These realizations come slowly, one moment at a time, one decision at a time. But with every step, the whole story loses more of its power. The script that once felt permanent begins to fade. And in its place, something new begins to take shape. Not a fairy tale written by someone else, but a life written by the woman herself. When a woman begins stepping away from the world script, something unexpected happens. At first, there is space, quiet space. For a long time, her days were filled with responsibilities, expectations, and the constant effort of making sure everyone else was okay. So, when she begins setting boundaries, when she begins choosing herself a little more often, life suddenly feels different. There is room to breathe, and inside that space, something begins to return, slowly, gently. She begins to remember parts of herself she had almost forgotten, the things she once loved, the dreams she once carried, the interests that once made her curious about the world. For many women, these parts of themselves were quietly pushed aside over the years. Not because they didn't matter, but because there was always something more urgent to take care of. Someone who needed help. Something that had to be done. So the dreams waited. The patient waited. The passions waited. Her one voice waited. But now, something inside her begins to wake up again. She might pick up an old hobby. She might start imagining a different kind of future. She might simply begin asking herself questions she never had time to ask before. What do I enjoy? What makes me feel alive? What kind of life do I truly want? These questions can feel both exciting and unfamiliar, because for many years she was taught to measure her value by how useful she was to others. Now she is learning to see herself in a different way, not as someone who exists only to serve, but as a full human being, someone with her own needs, her own creativity, her own desires. This rediscovery is not selfish. It is not irresponsible. It is simply the natural result of finally stepping out of a story that never truly belonged to her. The Cinderella story asked women to wait quietly in the background until someone else chose them. But in real life, a woman does not have to wait for permission to live fully. She does not have to hide her voice. She does not have to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She can build a life that includes kindness and strength, compassion and self-respect. Care for others and care for herself. And as she begins to rediscover who she really is, something beautiful begins to happen. The ashes of the war story start to fall away. And the woman who once believed she had to live like Cinderella begins to see the truth. She was never meant to stay in the ashes. She was always meant to stand in her own light. And so slowly the whole story comes to an end. Not with anger, not with rebellion, but with understanding. A woman looks back at the story she was given when she was young. The story that told her to be patient, to sacrifice, to wait quietly for the moment when someone would finally notice her goodness. For a long time, she believed that story. Not because she was weak, but because it was repeated everywhere. In fairy tales, in movies, in traditions, in her parents, and the small lessons passed down from one generation to the next. But now she sees something clearly. Cinderella was never meant to be alive. It was only a story that belonged to another time, another way of thinking. And once she understands this, something beautiful, that her life does not have to follow a script written by someone else. She does not have to live in the ashes. She does not have to wait for rescue. She does not have to earn love through exhaustion. Instead, she can begin writing a story of her own, a story where kindness still exists, but where kindness includes herself, a story where caring for others does not mean abandoning her own dreams, a story where love is not something she must suffer for, but something she can experience while still being fully herself. In this new story, a woman is allowed to rest, allowed to speak, allowed to take up space in the world. She can still be generous. She can still be compassionate, but she no longer has to disappear in order to do those things. And perhaps the most important part of this new story is this: a woman does not have to wait to be chosen. She can choose herself. She can choose the life she wants to build, the boundaries she wants to set, the dreams she wants to follow. And when many women begin to understand this, something powerful begins to change in the world. Because the world fairy tale loses its hold. The story of the girl waiting in the ashes slowly fades, and in its place a different story begins to grow. A story where women are not characters waiting for someone else to change their lives, but the authors of their own, writing pages filled with courage, with freedom, with self-respect, and with the quiet understanding that their lives were never meant to be a fairy tale written by them. Their lives were always meant to be a story they write themselves. One step, one choice, one chapter at a time. And now we come to the quiet end of our time together. We have traveled through many thoughts tonight, through old stories, through questions, through realizations, and perhaps somewhere along the way, something inside you become a little lighter. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply see a story for what it is. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply see a story for what it truly is. A story, not a rule, not a destiny, just something that was passed down and that we are free to step beyond. If you are listening to this tonight, maybe you have spent many years taking care of others. Maybe you have carried responsibilities quietly. You've been strong for a long time. And if that's true, then tonight you deserve something very simple. Rest, real rest. Not the kind where your mind is still racing, but the kind where you allow yourself to soften, to breathe slowly, to release the weight of the day. For this moment, there is nothing you need to prove, nothing you need to fix, nothing you need to carry. You are allowed to simply be here. Take a slow breath in and gently let it go. Allow your shoulders to relax. Allow your mind to settle. The words will continue tomorrow. The responsibilities will still exist. But tonight is not about solving everything. Tonight, it's about giving yourself permission to pause, to remember that you are human, not a character in someone else's story, just a person who deserves care, kindness, and peace, even from yourself. So, as you prepare to rest tonight, let your thoughts drift gently, like quiet waves moving across the surface of calm water. Let the world expectations fade into the distance. Let the stories that never belonged to you slowly dissolve. And keep only this quiet truth close to your heart. You are allowed to live your life in your own way. And tonight, you are allowed to sleep. So, close your eyes if they are not already closed. Take one more slow breath and allow the calm of the night to carry you gently into rest.